In the meantime, we're going to move right along to Judy Goldstein. Judy's paper is entitled A Night at the Ball, Landsmanshaftn Social Events in New York City from 1900 to 1939. Judy Goldstein is a graduate from Barnard and the Jewish Theological Seminary. Based in Manhattan, she currently works as a middle school teacher. So take it away, Judy.
Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so honored and excited to be presenting this work alongside Dina and Sarah. Um, Dina, I actually think that the liminality framework that you brought in is going to tie in really nicely to a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about in my presentation. Today, I'm going to be talking about the dances hosted by Jewish mutual aid organizations in early 20th century New York City. And I specifically want to highlight how these events were particularly important for Jewish women who were otherwise very much excluded from membership, at least officially, in many Jewish mutual aid organizations. So, as some of you may know, the organizations hosting these events were Landsmanshaftn, groups of Jewish immigrants organized by Eastern European hometown. So, Landsman means someone from your hometown. A more formal translation would be like fellow countrymen, and Shaft means organization, and the N on the end is what makes it plural. So one example of a Landsmanschaft would be the Amder Benevolent Association, which was founded in New York City in 1912 by Jewish immigrants from Amder, a shtetl in what is now Belarus. So these organizations provided literally tons of benefits to their newly immigrated members. So one of the most important was cemetery plots in Jewish cemeteries, sick benefits, and subsidized healthcare in a time before national social security, synagogue space, and connection to jobs and housing, memorialization after the Shoah. Often these groups were behind Yizkor books or memorial books, memorializing their town after the Holocaust, and of course, social events, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today. And I think what really set these organizations apart from other, like more institutional Jewish charity organizations is that it was lay-led. It was immigrants helping fellow immigrants, and that made a huge difference. So it's no wonder that Irving Howe, a prominent Jewish historian, described Landsmanschaftn as, quote, the most remarkable institution of the whole immigrant Jewish experience. And what's really interesting is that although these groups were formed in Chicago and Israel and Australia and Argentina, they really flourished in New York City. And around half of New York City's Jewish population was estimated to belong to a Landsmanschaft between 1880 and 1923. And as you might pick up on from these pictures, because Landsmanschaften were modeled after American fraternal organizations, wives, sisters, and daughters of members, while they were receiving certain benefits, they couldn't really fully participate in the organization as full-fledged members. But in the 1920s, there started to be more women's auxiliary organizations and co-ed organizations, and there were a couple from the beginning. And of course, there's so much work that was done by women behind the scenes that doesn't always make it into the archive or the secondary sources. But in general, I found that historians of the Landsmanschaften tend to keep their analysis focused to the men, while women are relegated, to a few pages. But I have found over the past few years that women actually did have an access point into their brothers and fathers' male-oriented organizations, which was social events. These events granted Jewish women of all ages a degree of autonomy that was often missing from their homes and workplaces. Young women took full advantage of the balls to dance and flirt with whoever they pleased, while their mothers found meaning in organizing the events themselves. So clearly, Landsmanschaft history is, in fact, women's history. But now I'd really like to pivot to discussing what the balls were actually like when I started researching, I really wanted to know what it felt like to attend them. What was the music like? What were people wearing? How did they get there? What did it actually feel like to go? And so that meant that a lot of my sources are not just from like more traditional academic sources, like oral histories and newspapers and archival materials, but also Yiddish literature, which I just found gave a lot of color to my understanding of what it felt like to go. So, like I said earlier, these events were really part of the social and physical fabric of Jewish immigrant life in New York City. If you were to find yourself strolling through the Lower East Side 100 years ago, you might see posters advertising for upcoming Landsmanshaft balls, like this one documented in 1933 by J.B. Lightman. If you were to open up the most widely read Yiddish daily newspaper, the Vorwärts, you would find like so many dances that you could attend to choose from. It was like a menu of Landsmannschaft dances. So I randomly selected this October 1912 Saturday, and I found ads for 15 upcoming Landsmannschaft balls on just one page. There were even more on other pages, and of course, other editions. And if you somehow missed all these ads, don't worry. Your organization or a friend's organization were also mailing invitations and tickets telling you to save the date. But once you had the date on the calendar, it was time to start planning for the big night. So when I was in high school, the most important part of homecoming and prom and graduation was what I was going to wear. And the dress just really could make or break the night. And so Jewish immigrants also really agonized over the perfect ball outfit. Yet we know that many of the attendants of these Landsmannschaft balls were immigrants or children of immigrants who were already struggling to get by on meager sweatshop salaries. So they didn't really have disposable income to spend on fancy dresses and suits, especially when it was a financial burden just to put food on the table. And yet, when researchers were touring dance halls around New York City, they noticed that at these dances, the poorest paid factory operatives were coming dressed in their best clothes. So I started wondering, how is this possible? Where are they getting these fancy clothes? So one obvious on the note here is that many people would go thrifting. This is definitely in Jordan today, very popular among my generation. Many other people rolled up their sleeves and made the dress themselves, especially because many women were seamstresses in New York City garment factories. And this is kind of parodied here in this cartoon from the Vorwärts from 1922. You kind of have to look past the misogyny a little bit, but you can still see that that this was like a pretty common phenomenon of women making their own ball gowns. But what I found to be the most common way of getting fancy clothes was neighborhood connections. So in one memoir, Samuel Chodsonoff's memoir about growing up on the Lower East Side as an immigrant, he describes how his sister Hannah saved up her money for weeks for a pink silk shirtwaist. And even though she manages to subsidize the cost by paying a neighborhood seamstress to make the garment, it's still a really expensive purchase. So she had to, quote, take measures to preserve its freshness. This is one of my favorite sources that I have found. He writes that she had tied a large white handkerchief around her waist, so arranged that it would protect the back of her shirtwaist from the perspiring right palms of her dance partners. When men asked her for a dance, but didn't keep their sweaty palms on the white handkerchief, she said politely, lower, please. And they continued dancing. We can see here that what you wore to the Landsmanshaft ball was a quintessential part of the evening, and that it was really important for Jewish immigrants to perform this role of ball goer to the fullest. So unsurprisingly, these balls were concentrated on the Lower East Side alongside Jewish immigrants, but it also wasn't uncommon to hold a dance up here in Midtown. And while these downtown venues were often cramped and crowded, especially in the early years of organizations when these bigger venues uptown were more financially unattainable, we see in Yiddish literature that these spaces still held a lot of romanticism and nostalgia. So in Kadia Maldowski's short story, A Fur Coat, from her collection, A House with Seven Windows, a Stube means even fence there, the protagonist Celie finds that the hall where the ball was held was adorned with small blue, green, and pink lights. The light was shadowy, colorful, and mysterious. The perfect intimate setting to meet old friends and potential lovers. And similarly, in his poem Nechum Avelim, Israel Jacob Schwartz describes how he, or the narrator, would only see his friends from his hometown shtetl once a year at a landslide ball. We'd embrace with great joy and call up the old times from the dead and late after midnight, we'd join together at long tables and never quite have our fill of talking. And this palpable nostalgia for the old world was multiplied tenfold by the klezmer music that often soundtracked the Landsmanshaft events. In his novel Die 10 Landslate, Klaver Paver writes about a klezmer musician named Zisha that plays the exact same melodies that he played in the protagonist's shtetl. And in fact, in reality, Landsmanshaft members would hire klezmer musicians from their shtetl to ensure that the music would be as nostalgic as possible. And if that musician wasn't available, they would have to reschedule the whole ball. It was a really big deal. But interestingly, I also found that while you might expect like all the music to be klezmer all the time, they also, I found in programs that they were also doing a lot of just like kind of classic America dance hall foxtrot tunes, because as much as they wanted to indulge in nostalgia, they were also trying to show off their Americanization. And part of that is that the dances were really intergenerational. So in this quote from self-published writer Fanny Kaufman, a dense crowd of old and young, women and men, and children adorned in their fancy clothes were rejoicing. These are indeed the people from her shtetl who survived those horrible years of terrors and pogroms. And we know, reading these sources from 2026, that the terrors and pogroms were still unfolding for their neighbors still in Eastern Europe. And during World War I and World War II, Landsmanshaftn organized fundraisers and did drives for their countrymen abroad. So often they were serving as fundraising opportunities in addition to social events. So this quote from the Oshminer Landsmanshaft says, "We demand that the poor and rich, in the name of the unfortunate and forlorn and brokenhearted, buy tickets that we send you and come to the ball. You will be entertained and meet your Landslaten friends, and at the same time, your quarters will relieve the hungry and miserable from our home city that hope and wait for our help." But for young people, especially, and especially young women, these balls were really about romance and sexuality. And I'll take a moment here to plug Sonia Gollins's book, It Could Lead to Dancing, Mixed Sex Dancing and Jewish Modernity, which inspired so much of this, but especially my thinking about courtship and romance. So if you're interested in learning more about this in particular, that's definitely where I would start. So one thing to keep in mind is that in the old world, courtship was very much mediated by your family and community reputation and like traditional expectations. I'm sure many of us are thinking about Fiddler on the Roof and Matchmaker. But in New York, these structures loosened, especially in urban immigrant neighborhoods. And these balls created these semi-regulated spaces where young men and women could meet independently. They could experiment with new forms of gendered interaction. And while the public, secular, quote, immoral dance halls were like seen as some immigrant parents as very sinister because they were secular, these Landsmanshaft dances were like kind of a middle ground. They were more kosher because they were like members of the community were there and could kind of watch over everything. And yet these balls were literally held in the same venues that the secular dance halls were. So young Jewish women were still able to use this heightened autonomy to experiment with flirting and sexuality. They could choose their dance partners. They could linger in conversation and experiment with flirtation beyond the strict oversight that had defined courtship in Europe. So they didn't dismantle communal norms entirely, but they did stretch them as we can see in this quote from Russian Jewish immigrant Gertrude Yellen's oral history. She said that we belonged to a Russian group of people, and they had dances and masquerade parties and whatnot, and I loved it. We would come home with boys. Naturally, we couldn't come home alone. We were two live wires. I'll show you the pictures. Um, I love this quote as well. We can really get a sense in her proud retelling of her teenage escapades that part of what made these dances so exciting was the sense of romantic and sexual freedom that came with them. Um, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit since I'm running short on time to talking about how Jews are still finding inspiration in these 20th century models of Jewish life. This summer, I attended a klezmer festival in Cummington, Massachusetts, aptly named Klez Cummington. And the theme this year was Landsmanshaftn Mutual Aid Banquet. And as the organizers so beautifully put it, these historic events created sites of encounter for members across age and gender lines that helped them continue the organizing work that sustains a more just society. And my hope is that by looking seriously at something like a dance, which maybe has not been taken so seriously by historians, especially Landsmannschaft historians in the past, we can understand how they were able to build like these durable worlds. And a note that I want to end on is that these balls weren't distractions from the real political and economic worlds of Jewish immigrants in the 20th century. They were really a part of the infrastructure that made that life possible. So that's where I'll end. Thank you so much for listening and coming. Yay.